Dodge and Salih had been going downriver to nowhere. At the same time, coming downriver from above were hordes of picnickers, full of beer and the desire to be mistaken for firefighters. They landed at the Meriwether picnic grounds and crowded into the guard station to hear whatever they could get near enough to hear. Soon it became impossible for Jansen to tell the picnickers from his volunteer barflies, so he tried by radio to stop all except official boating on the river. But the radio operator at Canyon Ferry was off somewhere. Jansen forever held himself guilty for not being concerned about the jumpers at this time, although it is hard to see the justice of his continual prosecution of himself. As everyone did who did not think of them, he assumed that jumpers were too good to be caught in a fire. They either had joined up with Hersey's crew on the Meriwether Ridge or had escaped over the head of the gulch into Willow Creek, but perhaps hadn't liked the looks of things from the very first and had not jumped at all. Once Jansen did try to radio Missoula about the jumpers, but another frequency kept cutting him off. Then he went back to the job of trying to get some coherence in his camp. As he knew there is no better way to do this than to start a training school, he tried to make a fire foreman out of one of the 3 men who had been on a fire before, and he tried to make a radio operator out of another volunteer. But his best luck was with 2 picnickers pretending to be firefighters, whom he trained to be camp cooks for a crew that had now grown to 35. A mystery of the universe is how it has managed to survive with so much help from volunteers. Jansen was also keeping an eye on the fire near the top of Meriwether Ridge, where he had sent alternate ranger Hersey and his crew of 19 men with 2 hold-at-all-cost orders. 1, hold the trail from the east open so that the jumpers could come down the ridge and join them, and 2, above all, hold the perpendicular trail behind them open so that if they had to, they could escape back to the camp and, if they had to, from there into the river. The fire now was definitely moving down the Meriwether slope. As it darkened, Jansen began to see flames making movies of themselves on the faces of the cliffs 1,500 feet straight above him. Hersey says that when some of the crew saw the cliffs reenact the fire, they tried to jump off them. In the wide world, Hersey was probably the only man in whose mind the smoke jumpers were constantly present. Their absence was heightened by the fact that Hersey had followed Harrison's tracks on the trail to the top of the ridge and the front of the fire. His tracks were easy to follow because he had been using his Pulaski as a walking stick, and going up that stepladder trail he had relied on it as if he and his Pulaski were a cripple and a crutch. What worried Hersey most was that at the top of the ridge, Harrison's tracks headed into some second growth, that the fire was already burning. Hersey spent most of his time organizing his crew into a fire line and giving them another speech about how to face danger. He gave them a speech about facing danger every time he walked around the head of the fire and every time the fire ran a reel of itself on the cliff. It would be interesting to know what he told them, because it seems to have worked fairly well. Anyway, his crew stayed on the line even after the trail up the ridge to the east had disappeared in flames. His crew, though, were drinking gallons of water more than seasoned firefighters would have, so he had to send one of them all the way down to Meriwether Station with a canvas sack for another load. When Jansen saw the water buck in camp, he became alarmed because the smoke jumpers had become non-existent in Jansen's mind. It was his own men 1,500 feet above his head who he thought were in danger. The returned water buck was a sure sign that Hersey intended to stay on the ridge and fight, and Jansen did not want him fighting fire after dark on the edge of a 1,500-foot pinnacles with a bunch of drunks. Now for the first time he also became alarmed about the jumpers, who the water buck was telling him had not shown up on Meriwether Ridge. If they weren't with Hersey's crew, there were a few places in the world that they could reach, where they would be safe. Jansen immediately ordered the radio at Canyon Ferry to get the radio at Missoula, to use all frequencies to locate the whereabouts of the jumpers. When he was advised by Missoula that it was unable to establish contact with the jumpers on any frequency, he then asked for the exact location of their jumping area. Quote, while they were giving me the exact spot, end of quote, he says, Foreman Dodge and Jumper Salih walked into the guard cabin at Meriwether, and Dodge reported that he had 2 injured men. This was at approximately 8:50 p.m. The volunteers and the picnickers and the drunks crowded into the cabin. Jansen had to take Dodge outside and up the canyon to get any coherent information from him. But what did Dodge know that was coherent? He knew that back in what earlier in the day had been Man Gulch were two badly burned men, one with a name Dodge did not remember, and one unburned man, Rumsey, watching the burned man with the name Hellman. What else was in the amphitheater for sure was fear and the smell of overcooked flesh. Jansen immediately ordered through the Canyon Ferry radio 1 doctor, 2 litters, blankets, and blood plasma. At 10 o'clock, Hersey came in with his terrified post-drunks, having kept them on the fire line until they had been several times trapped by it. He told Jansen about Harrison's tracks, and even more alarming, he told Jansen he had seen no jumpers or their tracks. We decided, Jansen said, to consider the rescue work the number 1 job and the fire the number 2 job. I asked Hersey to look after the fire job while I went for the jumpers. It is like that in the woods, and even in the wide world generally. The rescue of men and women, alive or dead, comes first. Of course, some step on the gas and leave them lying on the pavement where they landed, and some sneak off like Egyptian bas relief with their profiles looking one way and their bodies going the other way. But most people think they can be of help, and some even seem born to rescue others as poets think they are. The best of them goof, especially at first, because only a few have the opportunity to keep in practice. Then, as they catch on again, they become beautiful in performance. If one can step back for a moment to look, almost as beautiful as when, having completed their job of deposing death, they fade into complete anonymity. It was very hard, for instance, to rescue the names of those Jansen picked for his rescue team, even though he must have regarded them as his best. They all made mistakes, especially at first, but they also support the statement that one of the finest things men and women do is rescue men and women, even when they know they are rescuing the dead. This statement takes into account the Egyptian bas relief, the drunks, and the sobbing radios. At 10:30, while the rescuers were still waiting at Meriwether for the doctor and medical supplies to arrive, rumors and uncertainties were spreading through the camp. They spread in waves, and like waves spent themselves draining into the sand, but one kept resurfacing, the rumor that there were injured men downriver waiting to be picked up. Jansen left in a speedboat hoping to bring back the 11 missing men, but the report turned out to be about Dodge and Salih, who had been seen walking upriver by several boatloads of picnickers. This is a common enough way to start off a rescue operation, running after a rumor that turns out to be a misinterpretation of something already known. For a while, Jansen patrolled the lower river, signaling with the flashlight and occasionally cutting off his motor and yelling. Finally, a speedboat arrived with 2 doctors in it, T.L. Hawkins of Helena and his guest Ari Haynes of Phoenix, Arizona, and Jansen transferred to their boat and landed at the mouth of Man Gulch. Soon the big excursion boat with the rescue party in it arrived, only to discover they were all at the mouth of the wrong gulch. Dodge and Salih had come down a gulch below Man Gulch, and when they arrived at this lower one that came to be called Rescue Gulch, they discovered that the litters had been left 6 miles back at Hilger Landing. Almost as soon as the speedboat started back to get them, rumors and tension mounted among the crew. One of the worst things a rescue crew does is wait. They waited to start uphill immediately to find the injured men and let the litter crew come when the litters arrived. Jansen knew he had only one man who could lead them back through the night and fire and rolling rocks and exploding trees. Salih, who alone knew that he was just 17 years old. Acting again on the assumption that the one sure way to quiet a crew is to get them to do something, Jansen lined them up and conducted roll call, only to discover he had 6 or 7 men too many. They were picnickers who had smuggled themselves into the big excursion boat in the hope they could join the rescue crew. He had to cut them out and send them back. That left him with a crew of 12, counting himself, the doctors, and Salih. All tough men who had worked all day and now would work all night and probably the coming day in the agonizing valley. It was 11:30 before Jansen and his crew started up Rescue Gulch. They had 2 litters but only 1 blanket, which as it turned out was all that was sent back to them when they had sent out for blankets. But now the insanity of the fire had passed on and it lay twitching around its edges. like something dead but still with nerve ends. Its self-inflicted injuries had been great and had turned black. It laid in burned grass and split rocks with its passion spent. The crew crossed through the weakened fire line into the world that might be dead. About 2/3 of the way to the top, they heard a shout, which turned out to be Rumsey coming down the hill to refill the canteen for Hellman, who had been drinking water, getting sick at the stomach, then drinking more water until he drank it all. Rumsey told Jansen that he thought his guard, Harrison, was dead, because when last seen, Harrison had been sitting with his pack on his back, not able to take it off. Rumsey didn't know if the others had survived. Later at the review, when Jansen was asked if Rumsey had made any detailed comment to him at this time about himself, Jansen replied, "He made the following comment: 'The Lord was good to me. He put wings on my feet, and I ran like hell.' This was one good Methodist talking to another." Nearly half a mile away, the crew could hear Hellman shouting for water. In the Valley of Ashes, there was another sound, the occasional explosion of a dead tree that would blow to pieces when its resin became so hot it passed the point of ignition. There was little left alive to be frightened by the explosions. The rattlesnakes were dead or swimming the Missouri. The deer were also dead or swimming or euphoric. Mice and moles came out of their holes and, forgetting where their holes were, ran into the fire. Following the explosion that sent the moles and ashes running, a tree burst into flames that almost immediately died. Then the ashes settled down again to rest until they rose in clouds when the crew passed by. Jansen, Rumsey, and Sallee pushed ahead of the main party to get water to Hellman. Jansen was the leader of the rescue crew, and he should tell it. Hellman's face, arms, legs, and back were severely burned with loose flesh hanging in patches. He complained of the cold and was very thirsty. We let him rinse out his mouth and take on a little water. Water upset his stomach at first. In 10 or 15 minutes, the two doctors arrived. They gave Hellman a hypo, 1 quart of plasma, applied salve, transferred him to a litter, then covered him with the one blanket. According to Jansen, Bill's burned flesh and had a terrific odor. He was in severe pain but took his experience magnificently. Bill's courage made men weep. Jansen had seen men weep and had wept himself, but as soon as he saw that the problem was medical and the medical men were there, he was on the move again. He picked 2 of the rescue crew to accompany him across the ridge and into Man Gulch to explore ahead for the doctors and be ready to point out where the living and the dead lay hidden. He must have picked out the 2 he trusted most. One was Don Ruse, assistant ranger from the Lincoln district, and the other the 17-year-old boy he had met only a few hours before, who by now was on his way to prove his own secret belief that he was the best man on the crew. It was 1:20 a.m. when the 3 crossed the ridge and started down the other side. They soon ran into what Jansen describes as a 12-foot rim of rock breaking off on the Man Gulch side. Jansen said they had trouble finding a gap in it. Others before them had too. It would not be exact to say that the 3 in descending at night into the remnants of Man Gulch were descending into the valley of the shadow of death, because there was practically nothing left standing to cast a shadow. Since dead trees, especially, exploded and then subsided weakly into dying flames, perhaps it would be more exact to say they were descending into the valley of the candles of death. Rumsey speaks of the night as a pincushion of fire. At about 1:50, they heard a cry below and to the right. As they continued to descend, the updrafts brought a very suspicious smell. But Jansen says that because the wind was tricky, it was difficult to determine whether there was a series of bodies ahead or whether we were just smelling Silva. It took them another 10 minutes to find Silva, probably because Silva had been slipping in and out of consciousness during that time. When Jansen, Ruse, and Sallee reached him, Silva was standing on a rock, slanting heavily downhill, hunched over and wobbling to keep his balance. He couldn't stop talking. "Please don't come around and look at my face. It's awful." Then he said, "Say, it didn't take you fellows long to get here." He thought it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Jansen pulled out his watch and said, "It's 2 a.m. on the nose." Then in his report, Jansen speaks to us, since his hands were burned to charred clubs. I peeled an orange and fed it to him section by section. Silva said "Say, fellows, I don't think I'll be able to walk out of here." Jansen told him his walking days were over for the time being and he was going to get a free ride out. He tried to make this a joke, although it's hard to make jokes at night on a hillside that smells of burned flesh. Silva was worried about his shoes, which Dodge had taken off and placed behind a rock, so Jansen combed the slope with a flashlight until he found them. The knowledge that the shoes had been discovered comforted Silva, perhaps because he could not retain knowledge and had slipped back to thinking he would have to walk to the river. About 2:20, the doctors and most of the crew arrived and treated Silva as they had Hellman. Dr. Hawkins agreed with Jansen that it would be dangerous to attempt to move Silva and Hellman before daybreak, although the crew was ready to start stumbling in darkness through rocks and reefs to the river. Silva complained of the cold, as Hellman had, but Hellman was wrapped in the only blanket the crew had brought back on his return trip from Hilger Landing. Since most of the men were not wearing jackets, some of them stripped off their shirts and undershirts to wrap around Joe to keep him warm. As he was still cold, half naked, they huddled close to him. When he got warm, he got happy again. Several years ago, Dr. Hawkins, who treated both Hellman and Silva on the ridge and then in the hospital, told me that if I were burned and wanted to be as happy as Joe Silva had been, I should get terribly burned. Then, he said, your sensory apparatus dumps into your bloodstream. He added, usually it takes until the next day to clog your kidneys. In the meantime, it's possible to have spells when you think you are happy. Since only two could cuddle close to Silva at a time, others of the rescue crew spread out across the hillside looking for 11 missing men by flashlight and candlelight. It was like high mass until dawn. Lights walked about all night in the darkness. Silva encouraged those who remained with him by telling them that before they had arrived, he had heard voices of men calling from above. They were the voices of men working, and he had shouted back at them. Perhaps then it would be more exact to call Man Gulch on this night the Valley of Candles and the voices of dead men working. Daylight became a little after 4 o'clock, and Jansen walked only a few yards before running into Harrison's body. He identified it by the Catholic medallion around its neck and the snakebite kit, which he had given Harrison when Harrison became recreation guard at Meriwether. His body lay face down, pointing uphill and looking as if, instead of being a Catholic, he were a Muslim fallen in prayer. Jansen describes the earth as it looked at daybreak. The ground appearance was that of a terrific draft of superheated air of tremendous velocity, had swept up the hill, exploding all inflammable material, causing a wall of flame which I had observed from below at 5:30 p.m. the previous evening. 600 feet high to roll over the ridge and down the other side and continue over ridges and down gulches till the fuels were so light that the wall would not maintain heat enough to continue. This wall covered 3,000 acres in 10 minutes or less. Anything caught in the direct path of the heat blast perished. 3,000 acres is close to 4 3/4 square miles. At about 4:40 a.m., they started to carry Silva down Man Gulch to the river. The crew that left with him was only 6 men and the doctors, so Salih had to take his turn carrying the litter. It was also up to him to help identify the bodies. They tagged 3 while carrying Silva down the hillside. Jansen, who was noted for being a hard man on himself and his men, was sorry for Salih. What a great compliment for a 17-year-old. While they continued downhill, Jansen continued to be puzzled about why Harrison's body had been found so close to Silva. He had heard from both Salih and Rumsey that Harrison had given out from exhaustion, so Jansen had expected to find his body much lower on the hillside and farther back than any of the others. That he got up and climbed to where he did is as much a monument to his courage as the cross they put there afterwards. Jansen is the only one to have left an account at all inclusive of the discovery, identification, and removal of the bodies. Near each body he left a note under a pile of rocks, identifying the body and summarizing the evidence on which the identification had been made. He may have intended to expand these notes into a more complete account, but he never did. If he had tried to say more, it would have been too much for him and for us. Lower down the hillside than they thought any of the crew would be found, they came upon Stanley Reba's body. But when they examined it, they found he had broken a leg and then no doubt had rolled down the slope into the fire. He had literally burned to death. Most of the others, in all likelihood, had died of suffocation and were burned afterwards. Silva was carried to the mouth of Man Gulch by Jansen and his crew of 6, arriving there only a short time before Hellman reached the river by way of Rescue Gulch. Carried by Rumsey and the other members of the rescue crew, neither Silva nor Hillman was suffering because, as Dr. Hawkins adds, their burns were so deep and hard their nerve ends were destroyed. Each man was soon picked up by a speedboat, and each man's spirits rose. Silva arrived at the hospital in Helena at about 10 a.m., Hellman at about a half hour later. Dr. Hawkins told me that 10 was about the time for kidneys to fail. He immediately ordered an examination. The report was as expected. No urine found. There soon came an end to euphoria. Both Silva and Hellman were dead by noon. By 1, Jansen, who had been in charge of moving Silva to the hospital in Helena, was back in Man Gulch to renew the search with a fresh crew, including Dodge and a helicopter to fly the bodies to Helena. According to his plans, he should have been there at least 3 hours earlier, but the egg beater, which had been ordered from Missoula, picked him up at 12:30 instead of 9 o'clock. It's hard for the woods and machines to run on the same schedule, and almost never is it the woods that are late. Jansen had been the first one to be taken in on the helicopter shuttle, and he immediately started uphill tagging bodies. He started where they had found the 3 at daybreak, and then, as he says, worked up the ridge by contours. He says that he did not have much time to gather up the personal effects scattered around the bodies. The terrific blast of heat burned all clothing off, releasing non-inflammable effects, which, if not pinned down by the body, were carried as high as 100 feet further up the hill. He found watches or the remains of wallets only by rolling a body over. Late in the afternoon, he looked downhill and saw a charred stump of a man. He had already found the 9th body, so I didn't count him and didn't go close enough to determine if it was really a remains. He was through for the day, a long day that had begun early in the day before. Not until the next morning, the morning of the 7th, were all the remains found. Only when all the smoke jumpers and his crew had been accounted for did Dodge fly back to Missoula. It is not hard to visualize him, eyes bloody and clothes dirty, as Salih found him near the top of the ridge after the fire had passed over him. But it takes a moment of thinking to see him as his wife saw him when he stepped down from the plane in Missoula. Fastidious as ever except for the tobacco stains at the corners of his mouth. He had 5 more years to construct a life out of the ashes of this fire. Jansen had longer to live than Dodge, but those who knew him say he also had great problems rescuing himself. Asked by the Board of Review at what point he had given up being in charge of the rescue, he replied he just couldn't remember. He couldn't remember because he never gave up the charge. For instance, the year of the fire, he twice returned to Man Gulch to check his original observations of the blow-up. Afterwards, he wrote Jansen's ground check statement. Having twice walked and rerun his route with a stopwatch in hand, he concluded that his present report is within 2 minutes of the time I have shown in previous statements. In the end, he had to rescue himself from Man Gulch by asking to be transferred to another ranger district. It had got so that he could not sleep at night, remembering the smell of it, and his dog would no longer come in, but cried all night outside, knowing that something had gone wrong with him.